There are some extension points to application insights that can really help you get the most out of it. Let's mash on that.
Hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Asp.Net Monsters. In today's episode, we're going to continue to look at application insights. In today's episode, we're going to focus on correlating events across different services.
So we are going to continue to build on the example that we did last time. So we have our little sample app that gathers data from random places. But what I've done is also gone and added application insights to the backend weather service that we're calling. So we have our front-end app that makes a call to our backend weather service, and it gets some data and returns it. Now they're both pointing to the same application insights instance. So when I run this...
Can I ask you a question about that weather service? Was it always a weather service, or was it once a news service?
It was once a news service, which you can probably tell from a file name there, right?
From a namespace.
Yeah. Started out as a news service, and then I noticed that so I was going to build one using GenFu. And then I noticed that they changed the file new project template for Web API in Asp.NET Core to be a weather service by default. So like return something useful instead of just the controller that returned 1 and 2 or whatever it was that it used to do.
Perfect.
Yeah, so it's kind of a more useful example, and I was able to use it for this without having to write more code, which was good. Okay, so we have our sample app here. I'm able to run it, and what I want to show you is that if we go into application insights, there's something called an application map, which we didn't look at last time. But this is super cool. So it shows my app here in the middle, and all of the things that it's calling. So I can see that it's calling a local database, my Twitter context. It's calling this third-party API to get the users, and then it's calling itself, which isn't exactly right. And that's the thing that I want to fix here using something called a Telemetry initializer. But if we look at this is actually what's happening here is that's the front-end app calling the back-end app. And just because these are both deployed to the same machine, it kind of thinks it's like the same instance of a server. So it's a little bit confusing, but before we get into fixing that part of it, let's go and look at the end-to-end transaction details again. So if we go look at just the last 30 minutes, and I'll look at our most recent calls. Here I can see how things get correlated. So this 44382, that's my front-end app. Keep going to the wrong browser there. That's my front-end app. And then we can see that it calls that third-party API, and then it calls localhost again, calling the 44380, which is my weather API. It used to be a news API. So it correlates all of that into one thing, as opposed to seeing this weather forecast call as its like own separate end-to-end transaction call. It brings it all together here, which is really nice.
How the heck does it correlate that? Do you think it just does it on timestamps?
No, it's not on timestamps. So what it does is at the very beginning here, in this case, when the call comes into the server for my front-end app, it initializes what it calls an operation in application insights. And part of that is an operation ID that it generates. And we can see that here. If we open this to show all the details, there's an operation ID there. And that's actually going to flow through to every call down the road. So it actually hooks into the HTTP client, and it passes it in, I believe, as a header.
Okay.
Down to the call to the backend service. So that header has the operation ID that it's able to correlate back using a parent ID. So if I click down here, which is now the call that's happening on my backend server, and we look at the parent ID, we can see that the beginning part of the parent ID is actually the operation ID from my initial call.
Amazing. Okay, that's super cool.
Yeah. And that actually flows through even if when we start doing front end, like in the browser tracking, then it flows all the way up to the browser, and the root operation would then be the operation in the browser, the page view.
Yes.
So this is awesome, really useful, but it's a little bit confusing just because so Application Insights has this concept. Let's go back to my performance view here. There's this concept of roles. And if I click on this, you can see that it has no role name assigned. And if I expand this, there's Dave's desktop. But what I actually would like to see here is that I have two different roles. There's my front-end app, and then there's my weather service. I'd like to see those split out as separate things so that App Insights knows that that's not just like one application, one service that's running on a machine. So what we can do, the way that we do that is using something called a telemetry initializer. And I'm just going to create a new one here. So I'm going to add a new class, call it cloud role name initializer, which I always struggle to spell correctly.
Oh, I was just going to compliment you on how well you managed that.
I had to think really hard, Simon.
That's a tough one.
Okay, so this is Nite with, so I said
Yes.
telemetry initializer, but it figured out that what I actually meant was iTelemetry initializer from that particular package, and it fixes it for me. I like that a lot. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just implement the interface here, and so telemetry initializer is basically something that allows you to act on and change any piece of telemetry that's being sent out to Application Insights. So if you remember from the last episode, we talked about the different types of telemetry. They all implement iTelemetry, so that has like all the data that's in common with all of them. But that telemetry could be request telemetry, which would have different properties than a dependency to telemetry, and etc. In this case, we actually don't care what kind of telemetry it is. We're just going to say, for all the telemetry that comes in here, I want to set the cloud role name to something specific. So I'm going to go and do that now. And you do that through the context. So the telemetry has the context, which is of type telemetry context. And on there is something called cloud. And there's a role name that doesn't always get set to what you want it to. Role instance we typically leave alone, and it's going to default to the server that you're on. So if we were load balancing this server, which I'm going to call so role name here is going to be my front end. If we were load balancing this across 10 different servers, I would see a single cloud role name in App Insights called front end, and then I would have 10 different instances that I could see in there. So I'm going to set this one to front end, and I'm going to copy this for my other app. So we've created the initializer, but we also need to add it. And the way we do that in Asp.Net Core is simply by registering a singleton of that type. So I'm going to say add singleton iTelemetry initializer. Oh, I didn't do it that time.
Oh, it's a tough one.
And cloud role name. So we register a singleton of that type, and then Application Insights will pick it up. And we're going to go do the same thing for our weather service.
And we can register multiple telemetry initializers. So.
Yes, as many as we want. And they will process in the order that we register them, I think.
Oh, interesting.
I think.
That sounds about right.
That's hopefully not important most of the time, but it's something to consider for your custom ones.
I think that was one of the things that was being pushed for the dependency injection container when it was first being built, was that it should resolve things in the order in which they were registered. Because I remember that being a problem for like autofac and things like that.
Right. Okay, so same.
Smell.
Same thing here on my weather service. I'm just going to register it as weather service and add that singleton.
So, yeah.
I've lost all ability to spell now.
You just lost your confidence. It's okay, you can get it back. You just need like a performance coach to work with you on this. So.
That's exactly what I need, Simon.
You need like, do you remember those Terry Tate commercials years ago? Office quarterback.
I do.
Yeah.
You know what's happening now, right? My namespaces are confused. Okay, so let's run this. And run the front end, and let's see how that looks different in Application Insights now. Let's make sure we're hitting our breakpoint before we go looking for things in App Insights. Success.
All right.
So you can see initially the role instance is my machine name, and the role name is null, and we set it to front end. Easy enough. Okay, let's have a look here. See if that data came through yet. The first place we can look is on the application map. Woohoo! So this starts to look a little bit different now. We can see that we have our front end calling those two places. It looks like maybe our weather service isn't, that telemetry isn't up here yet. There it is. Okay, so over time, this other part here will just kind of disappear on the app map after an hour, and we're just looking at the more recent stuff. But now you can see that we have our front end service, which calls our weather service and calls the third-party service. This is more how we actually would want to visualize what's happening in our application here. Conceptually, that's what's happening, right? It's not an instance that's calling itself like what was initially implied. And if we go look at the end-to-end transaction details, or no, rather the thing I wanted to show you here is under roles. Now, instead of having this no role name thing, we can actually filter down to see just the things that are from my weather service or just the things that are with the front end. And the really cool thing, once you start having multiple instances, like in a production environment, is you can say, I only want to see the front end and one or two of the 10 instances that are running of that front end.
So this gives you the ability to say, hey, there's a problem with this one instance.
Exactly.
Let's go and take that out of rotation and put a different one in.
And that applies to more than just this performance tab. It's also under the failure tab, which is where we go investigate errors, which we haven't talked about. But if you had operations that were failing, you could come in here and look and see, well, what is it in my system that's failing? Is it the front end? And if it's the front end, is it just one of my nodes that's bad? This gives you the ability to filter things down more appropriately than when you don't have a role name specified. So that's a really quick intro to telemetry initializers and kind of the most basic thing you can do with it. But it's one thing that I think you should do because it's super useful and just helps you get the most out of the Application Insights UI.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Super useful, I think. So somewhere I have a blog post on how to add that cloud role name. If you're not using Asp.Net Core, there's a few different ways. And of course, this Application Insights doesn't just work on .NET code or on C# code. It works across a bunch of different stuff. So there's different ways of doing it in different places.
Yep.
But thanks, everybody, for joining us on another episode. And we will see everybody on the next episode, whenever that may be. And in the meantime, you can spend your time upvoting us and sharing stuff and all of those things that I'm supposed to ask people to do as forms of fiat currency in this modern world. Or you can send us real currency. That's fine, too.
Yeah, that works for me.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.